A woman stands in the grocery store staring at shelves she's walked past hundreds of times before and suddenly has the strange realization that almost every part of her life has been running on autopilot. The food she buys, the routines she follows, the way she answers people, the pace she keeps, and the responsibilities she automatically absorbs. Even the way she thinks about herself. And what's unsettling is not that any of those things are necessarily wrong. It's the realization that somewhere along the way, much of life became automatic, not consciously chosen, not intentionally designed, just repeated, inherited, adapted to. And I think many women arrive in midlife carrying a quiet awareness that something about the life they built no longer feels fully connected to who they are becoming, not because they're ungrateful and not because they want to abandon everything, but because there's a difference between maintaining a life and actually feeling connected to it. That distinction matters because a lot of people are functioning successfully while privately feeling emotionally disconnected from their own direction. The routine continues, the responsibilities continue, the calendar stays full, but internally something begins asking deeper questions. Do I still want to live this way? Does this pace still feel healthy? Do these priorities still reflect who I am now? Have I been reacting to life for so long that I stopped intentionally participating in it? And I think that realization can feel surprisingly because many women spent decades building lives around stability, responsibility, caregiving, productivity, achievement, or adaptation. Those roles often made sense. They were necessary. But eventually, people begin evolving psychologically. The nervous system changes, values change, energy changes, emotional priorities change. And what once felt sustainable can start creating internal friction. There's actually research in developmental psychology showing that midlife is often associated with increased self-reflection, reevaluation of meaning, and shifting motivational priorities. Not because something has gone wrong, but because the brain naturally begins orienting differently with age and lived experience. When you really look at younger adulthood, much of it is externally structured. Build the career, raise the children, manage the responsibilities, keep moving. There are often clear external metrics guiding decisions, but eventually many people reach a stage where external structure becomes less emotionally satisfying on its own. The nervous system starts craving more alignment, more intentionality, more emotional honesty, and this is where rebuilding life on purpose becomes important, not from a dramatic reinvention standpoint, but from a conscious participation standpoint, because rebuilding life on purpose is often less about becoming someone entirely different and more about finally asking, what actually reflects the person I am now? That question changes things, because without intentional reflection, people often continue living according to outdated internal programming. Patterns formed years earlier, paces established during survival seasons, habits built around stress, expectations inherited from family systems, culture, or old versions of themselves. And over time, what starts happening is the gap between external life and internal truth quietly widens. That widening creates emotional tension. Sometimes it shows up as irritability, sometimes it's numbness or restlessness, sometimes the strange feeling that life looks fine on paper but doesn't fully feel like yours anymore. The nervous system interprets prolonged misalignment as ongoing stress, because humans are not designed to permanently suppress authentic emotional signals. Eventually, the body starts responding. Mental fatigue increases, motivation decreases, emotional overstimulation increases, and people often begin wondering why even ordinary life feels strangely draining. But when you really look at it, constantly maintaining lives that no longer fully fit creates enormous psychological tension, especially for women who learned early to become highly adaptive, highly accommodating, highly responsible. Because adaptation can become so automatic that people stop noticing how often they override themselves. You say yes automatically. You absorb emotional labor automatically. You maintain exhausting dynamics automatically. You continue routines that no longer support you simply because they've existed for years. And eventually, life starts feeling more managed than lived. I think a lot of people underestimate how much emotional energy gets consumed maintaining identities and rhythms that no longer feel internally congruent. That's one reason intentional rebuilding can feel simultaneously relieving and terrifying. Because clarity creates responsibility. Once you begin seeing what no longer fits, it becomes harder to keep pretending you don't notice it. And that's where many women get stuck. Not because they don't know something needs to be changed, but because they assume rebuilding life requires burning everything down dramatically. The rebuilding on purpose usually happens much more gradually than that. Often it begins through smaller acts of honesty. You admit you're exhausted. You acknowledge that certain relationships can drain more than they nourish. You recognize that constant busyness is no longer emotionally sustainable. You realize your nervous system cannot continue functioning inside permanent overstimulation. You begin noticing which parts of life create steadiness and which parts create depletion. And over time, those observations start influencing decisions. That's important because intentional rebuilding is not primarily about aesthetics. It's about alignment. It's about creating a life that your nervous system can actually inhabit peacefully. And what's interesting about that is many people initially interpret this stage as losing ambition. But often they're not losing ambition, they're losing tolerance for chronic self-abandonment. That's different. Because eventually there comes a point where people no longer want success at the expense of their emotional health. They no longer want relationships built entirely around overfunctioning. They no longer want schedules that leave no room for recovery. They no longer want identities built exclusively around usefulness. And I think honestly that shift represents emotional maturity more than failure, because rebuilding life intentionally requires a level of self-awareness many people never fully allow themselves to develop. It requires slowing down enough to notice what genuinely energizes me now, what consistently depletes me, what kind of pacing feels healthy for my nervous system, what relationships feel reciprocal instead of extractive. What version of success actually feels meaningful at this stage of life? Those are deeper questions than productivity culture usually encourages people to ask. But they matter, because eventually the nervous system stops responding to externally impressive lives that internally feel emotionally unsustainable. There's also something psychologically important about recognizing that rebuilding life often happens through repeated small decisions rather than one giant breakthrough. You start protecting your evenings differently. You become more selective with your energy. You stop automatically volunteering yourself for every responsibility. You reduce overstimulation. You simplify your schedule. You become more honest in conversation. You allow yourself to want different things, and over time, those smaller decisions begin reorganizing the emotional structure of life itself. That's one reason values-based action research is so important psychologically. People tend to experience greater emotional well-being when daily behaviors become more congruent with internal values. Not because life becomes perfect, but because internal conflict decreases. The nervous system experiences more coherence, and coherence creates steadiness. I've noticed this in my own life at times too. There have been seasons where I suddenly realized I had spent so much time managing obligations that I hadn't fully stopped to evaluate whether the pace itself still reflected the kind of life I actually wanted. And once that awareness appears, it changes the way you move through decisions. Not overnight, but gradually. You start paying attention differently. You notice which environments calm your nervous system. You notice which conversations leave you emotionally depleted. You notice which routines create steadiness. You notice how much constant digital stimulation affects your mental clarity. And eventually, rebuilding becomes less about creating a perfect life and more about creating a more honest one. That distinction matters because perfection creates pressure, Honesty creates alignment, and alignment is usually much more sustainable. I think a lot of women are quietly arriving at a season where they no longer want to spend all of their energy maintaining appearances, overextending themselves, or organizing life entirely around everyone else's expectations. They want something more rooted, more emotionally breathable, more connected. Not necessarily smaller lives, but more intentional ones. Lives where attention is directed consciously instead of constantly scattered. Lives where rest no longer feels irresponsible. Lives where the nervous system is not permanently operating in management mode. Lives where success includes emotional well-being, not just external functionality. And maybe that's part of what rebuilding life on purpose actually means. Not abandoning everything, not becoming someone unrecognizable, but slowly reorganizing life around what genuinely supports who you are now. Because eventually there comes a point where people realize they do not want to spend the second half of their life disconnected from themselves. They want clarity, presence, emotional steadiness, relationships that feel reciprocal, pacing that feels sustained, choices that feel aligned. And those things rarely happen accidentally. They happen intentionally through repeated decisions, through honest reevaluation, through allowing yourself to evolve. So maybe instead of asking, how do I completely reinvent my life? A gentler and more useful question might be, what would it look like to begin participating in my life more consciously from this point forward? Because rebuilding life on purpose often starts there, not with dramatic declarations, but with awareness, with honesty, with smaller decisions that slowly begin creating a life that feels more emotionally sustainable to live inside. And over time, those smaller shifts begin changing something deeper. You stop feeling like you're merely managing your life. You start feeling more connected to it again. If this episode resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to Clarity Reset. And if you want additional tools to help you reconnect with clarity and intentionally shape the next season of your life, I'll leave the Clarity Reset resources below. And until next time, remember that rebuilding your life does not require becoming someone entirely different. Sometimes it simply requires becoming more honest about what truly supports the person you already are becoming.